We shot a human, but he just laughed and kept on coming. The first shot was center mass. The kind that drops most species where they stand. The human. He grinned. Commander Zarek of the Volcari Invasion Force had fought in 17 planetary campaigns. He knew what it meant when an enemy refused to fall. It meant disaster. It meant things were about to spiral into a nightmare. Fire again, he barked. Blaster rounds shredded the air. 3, 4, 5 shots, each one landing true. Plasma burned, kinetic slugs struck with bone-crushing force. Any one of those would have liquefied the organs of a Grellian, ruptured the exoskeleton of an Ekarth, or simply vaporized a Veltri. The human. He staggered, took a deep breath and kept walking. "What is this thing?" one of Zarek's warriors shrieked, voice edged with panic. The human wiped blood from his mouth, rolling his shoulder like he was working out a minor cramp. "That all you got?" It wasn't bravado. It wasn't some desperate last stand. No, the human looked annoyed. Like he was disappointed in them. Zarek took a step back, instincts howling at him. Target the head. The head. A sniper perched on the ruined remains of a starship fuselage took careful aim. The round fired, superheated plasma screaming through the air, striking the human squarely in the forehead. His head snapped back. For a long second he was still. Then, impossibly, he straightened. The wound. Already sealing. "Ow," the human muttered, rubbing his forehead. "That one actually kinda hurt." Zarek felt his stomach turn to ice. This was not a battle anymore. This was a mistake. And they were about to learn just how much of one. The wrong species to pick a fight with. The human cracked his knuckles. There was a wicked smile curling on his lips, but there was no humor in it. "All right," he said. "My turn." He moved. No, he blurred. 1 second he was 10 meters away. The next he was inside their formation, a fist smashing into the nearest Volcari soldier's chest with a sound like a gunshot. The warrior went flying, no crashing, into a bulkhead, unconscious before he hit the ground. Another shot. This one at point-blank range. The plasma bolt struck the human's shoulder. It sizzled against flesh, then faded. The skin was already regenerating. "Not good enough," the human said. His fist lashed out again. Another Volcari down. Panic broke through the ranks. Some tried to run. Others fired wildly. None of it mattered. The human, the impossible thing that would not die, was already among them, his movements effortless, terrifying. He weaved through gunfire like it was an afterthought. He took hit after hit and kept swinging. Kept laughing. "We shot a human." But he just laughed and kept on coming. Zarek barely had time to react before a hand seized him by the throat. He was lifted off the ground, easily, effortlessly, like he weighed nothing at all. The human looked up at him, and for the first time, Zarek understood what it meant to feel small. "You should have just left us alone," the human said, voice low, dangerous. And then, darkness. Chapter 1. First contact, first mistake. The battlefield was supposed to be an easy victory. That's what Commander Zilvek had assured them. The reconnaissance reports showed primitive bipeds, soft-skinned, warm-blooded creatures with no natural armor. No exoskeleton, no energy shielding, and worst of all, no known cybernetic enhancements. This species, the humans, had barely breached the threshold of interstellar travel. Their vessels were slow, crude things compared to the sleek warships of the Tavrak Dominion. It should have been a slaughter. And it was. At first. Our plasma rounds ripped through their front lines, sending soldiers tumbling. The kinetic impacts of our shock rifles shattered bones, sent bodies flying, and painted the battlefield in organic fluids. The humans panicked just as expected. Their communications channels were flooded with cries of pain and confusion. But then we saw him. A single human standing amidst the chaos. His armor was punctured in several places. Blood ran down his side. But instead of collapsing like his kin, he laughed. A deep, guttural sound, one that should have signaled agony but instead carried something else. Something unsettling. It took our communications specialists several seconds to translate the audio. "Oh, you bastards are in for it now." Then he started running at us. We fired. Of course we fired. Plasma bolts tore into him. Energy rounds burned through the armor and into his flesh. He should have fallen. But he didn't. He kept coming. Every step closer, more of our warriors hesitated. I saw it with my own eyes. Seasoned Tavrak soldiers trained since hatching began stepping back. Even the Dominion's enforcers, who executed deserters without hesitation, faltered. As he was still laughing. And then he was among us. The slaughter we had promised them was returned tenfold. He moved like a war beast, his blows crushing armor, snapping necks, ripping weapons from our grasp. He wasn't the strongest thing we had fought. He wasn't even the fastest. But he had something none of our simulations had ever accounted for. He refused to die. Chapter 2. The Horror of Humanity. I don't remember how I survived. One moment my soldiers were legion, our lines impenetrable. The next they were nothing but broken bodies. And at the center of it all, the human stood, breathing hard, his face a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He wiped the blood from his mouth, the blood of my warriors, and smiled. You guys sure picked the wrong species to mess with. I crawled back, trying to activate my distress beacon. My claws fumbled at my belt, my mind barely processing the loss of my arm. I hadn't even realized it had been ripped from me in the chaos. He saw me. He walked toward me, slow, deliberate. I had heard of predators that toyed with their prey before the final strike, but I had never seen it firsthand. My breath hitched as he knelt beside me. You shot first, he said. Didn't work out for you, did it? I wanted to spit, to hiss, to curse him in the name of the Dominion. But all I could do was shiver as he reached for his sidearm. My vision swam, my body already shutting down. Tell your people, he said, voice unervingly calm, to run. Then mercifully darkness took me. Chapter 3. The Unstoppable Force. The battlefield smelled of scorched metal and burned ozone. Captain Vralik of the Zari Dominion stood amidst the wreckage of his platoon, mandibles clicking anxiously. He had seen warfare, had fought against species that wielded plasma weaponry and razor-thin monomolecular blades. But he had never, in all his years of service, encountered something like this. The human stood in the center of the carnage, grinning. Vralik had put 24 rounds into the Terran's chest. His soldiers had unloaded their rifles, energy blasts searing through the air, striking his torso. Any other species would have collapsed, gurgling their last breath. But this human, this thing, had only laughed. It had charged through their lines, tearing his best warriors apart with its bare hands. Vralik knew fear. Real paralyzing fear. Fall back, he roared, his voice struggling to keep steady. His remaining troops hesitated, glancing at each other. They had fought long enough to know retreat meant dishonor, but after what they had witnessed, the human cracked its knuckles. You gonna run? Its voice was mocking, almost playful. That's no fun. Then it charged. Vralik barely had time to react before the human was on them. One soldier tried to raise his rifle, but a meaty fist caught him in the face, sending him flying backward. Another tried to stab with a bayonet, only for the human to grab the blade, wrench it free, and drive it into the attacker's gut. The soldier let out a gurgling hiss before collapsing. Why won't you die? Vralik bellowed, raising his own weapon. He fired 3 shots into the human's head. Each round hit its mark. The force sent the human stumbling back, its face obscured by smoke. Vralik allowed himself a single breath of hope. Then the human's silhouette emerged. Blood dripped down its forehead, but it grinned wider. Oh, that actually tickled. It lunged at him. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. Vralik barely managed to roll aside as the human's fists slammed into the ground where he had been standing. The force of the impact cracked the reinforced plating beneath them. This isn't possible, Vralik's mind screamed. He scrambled to his feet, barking orders into his communicator. We need orbital support. Now. His second-in-command, Thrak, responded. Sir, High Command is questioning why one human requires orbital intervention. Vralik snarled. Tell them to look at my unit's vitals. Silence. Then, understood. Bombardment in 60 seconds. Vralik turned back in time to see another of his warriors fall, their skull caved in by a single strike from the human's fist. How could something be this strong? Even their armored vehicles struggled to withstand sustained damage, yet this creature was taking direct energy blasts and laughing. The human turned to him, its eyes shining with something almost predatory. 60 seconds, Vralik muttered, stepping backward. They could stall for just a little longer. The human cracked its neck. What's wrong? Losing your nerve? Vralik was about to respond when the human moved. Fast. Too fast. Before he could react, a fist slammed into his gut, sending him flying backward. He crashed into a pile of wreckage, groaning. His vision swam. He had fought many wars, led thousands of warriors into battle. But this was something else. He forced himself to stand as the human approached, stepping over the corpses of Vralik's fallen soldiers. "I'll give you credit," the human mused. "You guys lasted longer than most." Vralik clenched his jaw. "You're a monster." The human chuckled. "No. Just a guy who really hates getting shot at." Above, the sky glowed. The orbital strike was imminent. Vralik's only hope was that it would be enough. Chapter 5. The Monster That Wouldn't Fall. The battlefield was supposed to be silent by now. The calculations were precise. The strike teams were elite. The weapons had been tested against everything the known galaxy had to offer. And yet the humans still stood. General Kareth of the Vrax Dominion watched the impossible unfold before his multiple eyes. Their assault squads had encircled the human, pelting him with plasma rounds. The intense heat alone should have incinerated flesh, melted armor, and left nothing but charred remnants. But the human just kept laughing. It wasn't the laugh of a being in pain, nor one suffering the effects of madness. Oh, it was worse. It was amused. Enjoying itself. "Keep firing." Kareth roared into the command relay. His soldiers hesitated. Some had already begun backing away. The human, covered in scorched fabric and smoking wounds that should have incapacitated any other species, raised its head. The grin that stretched across its battered face was far too wide, its teeth gleaming even through the gore. "Come on," it taunted, voice hoarse but strong. "Is that all you've got?" Kareth's stomach twisted. This wasn't war. This was a nightmare. The Dominion had faced many threats over the cycles, but this was different. The creature before them wasn't just enduring, it was thriving. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the acrid tang of plasma discharge, but the human showed no sign of slowing. That it lunged. Chapter 6. No weapon left to try. The sheer brutality of the counterattack shattered whatever remained of the Dominion's morale. Kareth had never seen his elite soldiers break. Yet as the human tore through their ranks, its bare hands wrapped around rifles, snapping them like twigs, he watched his best warriors flee. They abandoned their formations, their discipline, their honor. All that remained was fear. One brave soul, a sharpshooter from the Jalarian caste, managed to land a direct shot to the human's eye. The force sent the creature stumbling backward. For a moment, hope. Then, with an almost casual motion, the human wiped at its ruined socket. A sickening crunch followed as bone reset, sinew twisted, and impossibly the eye began to heal. It should be dead. It should have fallen. It should not be grinning. "Oh, that one actually hurt a little," the human admitted, rolling its shoulder. "Nice shot." Kareth's blood ran cold. There was no strategy left to employ, no weapon left to try. Their only hope was to run. As his soldiers scattered, the general turned to his command ship. He had to warn the Dominion. They had made a mistake. Humans weren't warriors. They were monsters. Chapter 7. The Unstoppable Advance. The battlefield had long since become a place of whispers. Whispers of the human. Admiral Veshtar watched the screen with horror as the surveillance drones relayed footage from the front lines. The human, known only as Sergeant Cole Reynolds, walked through the battlefield, his armor scorched, riddled with bullet holes, and yet he still advanced. Plasma bolts, kinetic rounds, and explosives had all been used against him, and still he laughed. The deep, unsettling sound carried over the comms, broken and static-laden, but unmistakably filled with mirth. What is he?" Veshtar muttered. His claws dug into the metal railing before him. "We don't know, sir," his tactical officer Lieutenant Yarkesh replied. "All logic dictates that he should be dead. The damage to his armor alone should have incapacitated him. And yet, he keeps coming." The enemy forces, soldiers of the Zerkai Dominion, had begun to fall back. Not out of tactical necessity but out of sheer terror. The human had been shot, burned, crushed under debris, and even hit with a direct orbital strike. And yet he still stood, brushing off the dust and stepping forward. The horror of war had a new face. And it laughed in the face of death. Cole felt the impact of another kinetic round slam into his side. He stumbled but caught himself on a piece of debris. His HUD flickered, displaying critical damage warnings he had long since learned to ignore. He grinned. "That all you got?" he called out. The enemy soldiers hesitated. Their glowing visors betrayed the fear behind them. He could smell it in the air. Could sense the way their weapons trembled in their hands. Cole straightened up, rolling his shoulder with an audible pop. Blood trickled down his arm where shrapnel had embedded itself, but he ignored it. Pain was an old friend. "You can run," he said, stepping forward, "but I'll still find you." A burst of plasma fire erupted from one of the soldiers, striking Cole square in the chest. The force sent him backward, but he planted his feet and leaned into it. When the flames cleared, he was still standing. And he was still laughing. The soldiers turned and ran. Chapter 8. They brought everything. And it wasn't enough. Veshtar had called in reinforcements. Not just reinforcements, an entire armada. 50 warships. 2 superdreadnoughts. Every high-caliber weapon the Dominion possessed. Their orders? Annihilate the human. The battlefield had become an abyss of fire. The air shimmered with the heat of orbital bombardments. The ground was glassed, turned into molten rivers that swallowed everything in its path. And yet from the flames a shadow emerged. Cole Reynolds walked through the inferno. His armor was barely holding together, the plating melted and cracked. His helmet had been torn off, revealing a bloodied face twisted in a grin. "You really don't get it, do you?" he muttered, cracking his knuckles. The Dominion forces threw everything at him. Artillery rained down. Energy weapons carved glowing scars into the landscape. Bombers screamed overhead, dropping payloads meant to wipe out entire cities. Cole barely flinched. He broke into a sprint. The first defensive line fell in seconds. A soldier raised his rifle. Cole grabbed him by the throat and slammed him into the ground hard enough to crater the soil. Another swung a blade. Cole caught it with his bare hand, twisted it, and drove it into the wielder's own chest. The third he simply backhanded, sending the poor soul flying 20 feet before colliding with a burning wreckage. The Dominion's mighty war machines entered the fray. Walkers, tanks, mechanized battlesuits. They unleashed a coordinated barrage, turning the battlefield into a maelstrom of destruction. Cole walked straight through it. He leaped onto a tank, pried open the hatch, and tore the pilot out with his bare hands. The walker fired a railgun slug that should have obliterated him, but he sidestepped at the last moment, closed the distance, and ripped the weapon off its mounting like it was made of paper. The Dominion's command center was in a panic. "We can't stop him," one officer shrieked. "He's not human. He's not." Cole's voice cut through the comms. "You shot me." His voice was calm. Too calm. Veshtar turned to the screen, watching in horror as Cole stormed the last defensive position, his hands covered in blood, his breath ragged, his eyes burning with something far worse than rage. "And I kept on coming." The last thing the Dominion forces saw before the feed cut out was the human, laughing as he reached for them. Then the screams began. Chapter 9. The Unkillable Terror. The battlefield was silent for a moment, an eerie, unnatural pause as the dust settled. The enemy had fired everything they had. Plasma bolts, kinetic rounds, explosives. And yet the humans still stood. Captain Vorkesh of the Yiltharian Vanguard stared in disbelief. He had seen death. He had seen warriors torn apart in the throes of battle. But he had never seen anything like this. The human should have been dead. Its armor was scorched, riddled with holes, and yet it moved. No, it laughed. The sound was guttural, primal. It wasn't amusement. It was something darker. A warning. "Commander, we must retreat." One of the soldiers at his side whispered. "This thing is unnatural." Vorkesh knew retreat meant disgrace. Cowardice. Yet standing before him was a living impossibility, something that defied logic and reason. The human cracked its neck and took a step forward. "You done?" it asked, voice like a growl. The translator struggled to make sense of the menace dripping from its words. A squad of his soldiers opened fire. Plasma scorched the ground around the human, burning everything but it. He saw the bolts hit, saw flesh and armor sear, yet it kept coming. The bullets that had struck it before must have punched holes in vital organs. Nothing should be able to keep moving after that. And yet the human grinned. The expression wasn't joy. It was hunger. Vorkesh took an involuntary step back. "Monster," one of his soldiers whispered. The human charged. The first impact was brutal. The human moved like a force of nature, smashing into the front line with such sheer, overwhelming power that the entire formation broke instantly. A clawed warrior of the Shulvath lunged, twin blades striking at the human's throat. A blur of motion, then blood sprayed the dirt. The warrior's arms fell first, the rest of his body crumpling a second later. The human was still laughing. Blades shattered. Bones snapped. Weapons discharged in desperate panic, only for the human to rip through their ranks like a hurricane of destruction. His hands became weapons, crushing skulls and snapping spines. When its rifle ran dry, it used it as a club, swinging it with bone-breaking force. Even the ones who fled were not safe. By the time the storm passed, there was no more army. Only bodies. And a single human standing in the middle of the carnage, breathing heavily, covered in blood that was not his own. Chapter 10. Fear spreads like fire. The survivors spoke in hushed whispers, voices trembling with fear. Stories of the unkillable humans spread like wildfire, traveling from one battlefront to the next. At first, the commanders dismissed it as exaggeration, battlefield hysteria. Then came the footage. The recordings. The undeniable proof of something that should not exist. It wasn't just that the humans survived. It enjoyed it. Admiral Threx of the Vorn Dominion watched the footage for the 5th time, his mandibles clicking together in nervous agitation. His fleet had conquered dozens of species. They had broken empires, shattered civilizations. Yet this single human had undone an entire division with nothing more than sheer resilience and savagery. A low-ranking officer hesitated before speaking. "Admiral, what do we do?" Threx exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. "We adapt." He pulled up data on human biology. He scoured the reports of past conflicts. There had to be a weakness. Something they had missed. Then his eyes landed on a phrase he had overlooked before. Adrenaline response. Humans in extreme conditions may enter a state where pain is ignored. Injuries become secondary and strength, speed and aggression increase significantly. Threx's eyes widened. They don't just survive. They evolve under stress. The officer swallowed hard. If they can ignore pain and fight until their bodies give out, then how do we defeat them? Threx had no answer. Elsewhere in the darkness of an alien war council chamber, the whispers of fear turned into something else. Panic. Entire war fronts had begun to collapse. Morale was disintegrating. In every battle where the humans fought, the enemy now hesitated. They fired first. They struck first. But they knew it wouldn't be enough. Because when the smoke cleared, the humans would still be standing. And they would be laughing. Chapter 11. The Unstoppable Force. The battlefield was silent, save for the labored breathing of those still standing. Smoke curled through the air, mingling with the acrid scent of burned metal and ozone. Commander Zilthar of the Vorthani Dominion pressed a trembling hand against his wound, his 3 hearts hammering in his chest. He had seen many horrors in his years of war, but nothing like this. The human was still standing. They had shot him. Dozens of times. Plasma bolts had seared his flesh, kinetic rounds had punctured his armor, and yet he was still there, his lips curled in a grin that sent chills through Zilthar's exoskeletal frame. You've lost too much blood," Zilthar managed to stammer. "You should be dead." The human chuckled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the damage. His name was Sergeant Daniel Carter, and he was a nightmare given form. His wounds leaked red onto the scorched earth, yet his posture remained unshaken, his stance one of pure, unrelenting defiance. "You don't get it," Carter said, his voice hoarse but still carrying that maddening edge of humor. "Pain doesn't stop us. Fear doesn't stop us. You think we break easy, but that's where you're wrong." He took a step forward, boots crunching on shattered armor fragments. The Vorthani warriors, still able to fight, hesitated, their weapons trembling in their claws. Carter laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers through the remaining Vorthani. "Go ahead. Shoot me again. See what happens." Zilthar knew what would happen. They had already emptied their magazines into him, only to watch in horror as he kept coming, kept fighting. The rumors were true, humans were unkillable. Or, at the very least, this one was. With a motion almost too fast for the eye to follow, Carter lunged. A plasma rifle was torn from a Vorthani soldier's grip and turned against its owner. The shot burned through alien armor, sending the soldier sprawling. Carter didn't stop. He moved with brutal efficiency, fists and weapons becoming an extension of his indomitable will. By the time the last Vorthani dropped, Zilthar was on his knees, his hands raised in surrender. Carter towered over him, battered, bleeding, but victorious. "This war," Zilthar gasped, "it will not end with just one battle. Carter wiped blood from his face and grinned. Then I guess I'll just have to keep coming. Chapter 12. Legends never die. Word of the battle spread faster than light. Across the Dominion, whispers of the unkillable human filled every command chamber, every war council. Some dismissed it as mere propaganda. Others saw it for what it was, a dire warning. Fleet Admiral Zoker stared at the footage for the 100th time. The human should have fallen. No being, no matter how resilient, should have been able to endure that kind of damage. And yet there he was, standing tall, smiling, daring them to try again. Do we have confirmation that he is still alive? Zoker asked, voice clipped. The intelligence officer hesitated. We have conflicting reports, Admiral. Some say he was mortally wounded but refused to die. Others claim he is already back on the front lines. Zoker's mandibles clicked in irritation. And which is the truth? Both, sir. For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Zoker felt something foreign twist in his gut. Dread. Humans were already a formidable species, but this was beyond comprehension. Zoker turned to his second-in-command. Issue a Dominion-wide directive. Engage with humans only when absolutely necessary. Avoid direct confrontation if possible. His officer's eyes widened. You want us to retreat? No, Zoker muttered. I want us to survive. Meanwhile, deep in enemy territory, Sergeant Daniel Carter sat on the edge of a medical cot, his body wrapped in biofoam and stitches. The pain was immense, but it was familiar. It was proof that he was still here, still fighting. A fellow soldier, Private Lou, shook her head in disbelief. You should be dead, Sarge. Carter smirked. Yeah, well, they'll have to try harder next time. He glanced at the window at the Chapter 13. The Monster We Created. Captain Vrylock stood on the bridge of the Krawl dreadnought Vengeance Unbound, his mandibles clicking in unease. The human had survived orbital bombardments, direct plasma strikes, and enough kinetic rounds to reduce a war beast to pulp. Yet somehow he was still coming. The hollow display flickered, revealing the battle-scarred surface of Argoth 7. Fire burned across the ruined colony, and amidst the carnage, a single figure moved through the rubble, bloodied, grinning, and unstoppable. The human. What do you mean he's still alive? Vrylock demanded, slamming a clawed fist against the display. Our entire forward assault team was wiped out. A trembling Krawl lieutenant answered, We don't know how, Captain. The scanners confirm his vitals. He was shot, burned, and crushed, yet he just keeps laughing. Vrylock snarled, turning to his war strategist. Deploy the behemoth warframes. Overwhelm him. Burn the entire area to glass if you have to. This ends now. But deep down he wasn't so sure. The ground trembled as the behemoth warframes deployed, towering mechanical titans built to exterminate entire cities. Each one was armed with plasma cannons and reinforced armor, designed to withstand the deadliest of human weapons. But the human? He just smiled. Sergeant Dern of the behemoth squad aimed his heavy railgun. Target acquired. Engaging. A blast of hypervelocity rounds screamed through the air, striking the human dead center. Dust erupted in a violent cloud. The squad held their breath, watching thermal scanners for signs of movement. Then the dust settled, and the human was still standing. His armor was shattered, his flesh torn, yet he grinned. A grin devoid of reason, fueled by something far worse than rage. A terrible joy. Is that it? He asked, cracking his knuckles. My turn. He launched forward. The first behemoth had no time to react. A single punch cratered its chest plate, tearing out critical circuitry. It toppled, smoke billowing from its ruined frame. The human was a blur, moving faster than any unaugmented being should. He tore through the second warframe, ripping apart steel and flesh with unnatural strength. Panic spread through the Krawl ranks. Their greatest war machines, reduced to scrap by a single laughing human. Captain Vrylock watched in horror. This isn't a man. This is a demon. And for the first time in his long military career he felt fear. Chapter 14. The Laughing Nightmare. The War Council of the Krawl Dominion convened in hushed urgency. Holograms displayed the carnage on Argoth 7, looping footage of the human tearing through their best forces. The High Commander, Grand Strategist Morvath, narrowed his eyes. Are you certain the reports are accurate? Captain Vrylock, now pale and shaken, nodded. Yes, Commander. He has endured weaponry that should have erased him from existence. Every attempt to kill him has failed. And he enjoys it. Silence fell upon the chamber. Then we have but one option, Morvath muttered, turning to the assembled warlords. We must retreat. A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Retreat? We are the Dominion. We do not flee, one of the warlords protested. Morvath activated a visual of the human's last recorded transmission. It was a simple, chilling message broadcast to every crawl ship. You can run. You can hide. But I'll find you. And when I do, we'll have a good laugh together. The crawl had raised worlds, enslaved civilizations, and fought countless wars. But never had they faced a creature like this. A being who did not fear death. Who did not break under pain. Who laughed in the face of destruction. And so, for the first time in recorded history, the Crawl Dominion retreated. Not from superior numbers. Not from devastating weaponry. But from the unstoppable horror that was one laughing human. Chapter 15. The Reckoning. The battlefield was a nightmare of smoke, shattered metal, and bodies strewn across the broken terrain. Captain Vexer of the Zalvani Dominion stood in the command bunker, his quills bristling as he stared at the holographic display. The human was still advancing. He should be dead, Vexer muttered under his breath. By the void, he should be dead. Lieutenant Ralcath swallowed nervously beside him. Sir, we've hit him with plasma rounds, disintegration rays, and kinetic bombardments. He laughed them off. The human was closing in. His armor was scorched, cracked in places, revealing raw flesh that should have rendered him immobile. But he wasn't just moving, he was running. And he was grinning. The Zalvani had heard of humans, the so-called apex predators of their backwater system. But nothing in their military dossiers had prepared them for this. For him. Deploy the heavy artillery, Vexer ordered. The ground quaked as the orbital bombardment command was relayed. Massive shells rained down from the sky, hammering the ground where the human had been. The bunker shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Silence. Then through the smoke and fire a voice rang out. That tickled. The human emerged, armor half melted, an insane gleam in his eyes. He hefted a railgun the size of a Zalvani warlord and pulled the trigger. Hell broke loose. Chapter 16. The Last Stand. Vexer had never felt true fear before. Not when he had commanded fleets against the Mazari Reavers. Not when he had faced down execution at the hands of the Emperor himself. But now, as the human charged their last defensive line, he knew terror. Fall back, he screamed. All units, fall back. But it was too late. The human tore through the barricades like they were paper. Plasma bolts seared his flesh, yet he pressed on. Explosions erupted around him, yet he only grinned wider. The Zalvani elite guards, the Dominion's finest, formed a desperate firing line. The human barreled into them, swinging his massive gauntlet fists. One blow shattered an armored warrior's helmet. Another sent a soldier flying through the air like a ragdoll. Then the worst sound of all, laughter. Damn, you guys really don't quit, huh? The human chuckled. He cracked his neck. But neither do I. Vexer tried to run. He really did. But the human was faster. He grabbed the captain by the throat, hoisting him into the air like he weighed nothing. You're a demon, Vexer gasped, struggling against the iron grip. What are you? The human smirked. Just a guy who doesn't know when to quit. Then he threw Vexer into the wreckage like a discarded toy. The battle was over. The Dominion's greatest warriors had fallen. And standing amidst the ruins, covered in soot and blood, the human stretched and let out a satisfied sigh. Welp. That was fun. He turned and walked away, humming a tune. Somewhere in the galaxy, a new legend was born. The kind that would keep warlords awake at night. The kind that would make entire species reconsider crossing humanity. And the Zalvani Dominion? It would never be the same.